On September 29th, 1887, a hard wind came down from the north before sunrise and held the air at 27 degrees, and by the time the light reached the false front buildings of Sage Hollow, frost had silvered hitching rails, pump handles, and the split plank walk in front of Pike General Goods. The town stood in a shallow Wyoming basin where weather arrived without courtesy, a ranching and rail-stop settlement of 312 souls tied to one spur line, one church, one blacksmith shed, and one merchant ledger that decided who ate on credit and who did not. Wagons creaked in from outer homesteads, coal smoke lifted low and gray, and the church bell marked 6 as Kane Jordan rode in behind a mule wagon loaded with tools, crates, and one wrapped parcel he kept within arm's reach. He was 36, broad through the shoulders, wind-burned across the cheekbones, and plain in manner, the sort of man who measured before he spoke and checked a latch twice before sleep. His chestnut horse, Maple, moved with patient economy, and the mule behind held steady under cargo that looked modest until unloaded. 2 steel spades, a short-handled mattock, measuring poles cut to 1-foot marks, iron pry bars, a hand auger, rope, pulleys, a box of mason chisels, and ledgers wrapped in oilcloth against dust and weather. He asked for no welcome and offered no story to the men at the rail stop platform who watched him pass. He rode first to the recorder, then to the town builder, and by noon he had paid $18 for a narrow, stony parcel behind the churchyard slope, a strip that pitched toward hard ground and was dismissed by most buyers as useless. The builder who sold it to him, Ezra Flint, ran his thumb along the deed edge and said the place was fit only for badgers and scrub roots, with too much stone for easy footings and too little topsoil for kitchen gardens. But Kane accepted the paper, folded it once, and put it with the oilcloth bundle as if the transaction carried no insult at all. By evening he had set his wagon on the lot, staked corners with cotton string, and driven 4 marker pegs where others expected no structure worth naming. The churchyard fence cast long bars of shadow over his stakes, and those shadows mattered to him. He had chosen the parcel for drainage, slope, and depth potential, not appearance. He had chosen it because winter did not negotiate with pride. Elin Jordan had died in February of that same year, 10 miles east of Rawlins, in a boarding house room where the stove had burned clean and hot, but her lungs had failed anyway after a week of fever. She was 31. Kane had buried her on a thawing morning when sleet ran down his coat collar, and the minister's words vanished in the wind. He did not sell her belongings in haste. He kept her notebooks, her household tallies, and 3 ledger volumes she had compiled over 9 winters, each line written in neat columns: flour pounds per soul per week, root loss percentages by storage method, lamp oil burn rates by wick trim, pork ration adjustments for hard labor days, salt use for curing by barrel temperature. In the rear pocket of the last volume, Aylin had tucked a folded sheet in her mother's hand, copied years earlier from Finnish notes carried through 2 migrations and 1 Atlantic crossing, explaining deep earth chambers, stone thermal mass, and vent rotation to hold near 55 degrees when the surface world turned lethal. That chain of knowledge had not begun in Wyoming and had not ended with grief. Elin's mother, Sanna Rautinen, had learned winter storage in a village near Oulu, where ground froze deep, and food planning was the difference between spring planting and spring burial. Aylin had translated those methods into frontier arithmetic. Measure by souls, by weeks, by fuel, by known spoilage, never by hope. Kane had learned by working beside her, by cutting and stacking, by carrying crocks into packed earth rooms, by recording what failed, and by hearing her say that one careless autumn decision could appear as a funeral in January. He carried that sentence with him like a tool. During the first week of October, while freight rates still ran low and roads remained passable, He spent $42 and recorded each purchase in Eland's ledger under a new heading marked Sage Hollow. $16 for lime in sealed sacks, $9 for hand-forged hinges and latch hardware, $11 for salvaged timber beams from an abandoned freight shed, $4 for iron vent collars, and $2 for wool felt strips to seat door edges tight. He bought no decorative lumber. He bought no paint. He bought what endured damp, pressure, and repeated opening in freezing weather. The store clerk, under Gideon Pike's supervision, remarked that such hardware would outlast any kitchen pantry in the territory. Ken answered that kitchens were for meals, not for January. Gideon Pike kept the largest storefront between Laramie and the county line, a two-room concern with stacked barrels, imported cloth bolts, bright tins in the window, and a polished counter that made strangers feel they had entered an institution rather than a shop. He was a man in his 40s with a careful beard, heavy wool coats from Eastern suppliers, kid leather gloves for ordinary mornings, and a gold watch chain that flashed when he reached for his account book. Half the valley carried balances with him through winter, and he treated that ledger as civic order, tapping its edge when customers asked for terms. When Kane bought lime by sack and hinges by weight, Pike paused with pen lifted, ran the figures twice, and gave the clerk a long look that said enough about what he thought of one-man overbuilding. Kane did not seek approval and did not ask credit. He paid cash for every load and hauled it himself, using the mule wagon for stone and beams, maple for lighter runs, and his own back for what could not wait. He began excavation on October 5th at first light, after checking grade with a weighted line and setting a 10-foot by 12-foot rectangle with corner stakes, then cutting sod in clean strips and laying it roots up in rows to dry for later berming. By noon, he had broken through topsoil into mixed gravel. By dusk, he had reached 3 feet and hit the first shelf of stubborn stone. He sharpened tools at lantern light and resumed at dawn. The labor went forward in measured stages, not dramatic but relentless, and by October 12th, the shaft had descended to 8 feet with cribbing placed at intervals. Drain channels sloped 1 inch for every 6 feet toward a gravel sump, and spoil piles sorted by use rather than abandoned in mounds. Children on their way from lessons stopped along the fence line to watch him winch buckets of earth with a simple tripod and block. And adults at the hitching rail began to refer to the cut as Jordan's shaft, with a tone that held amusement and distance in equal measure. Kane acknowledged neither. He kept marking depth on the ledger margin at day's end, then adding figures for expected capacity by bin and barrel. By mid-October, he had reached 14 feet and met hard clay, the layer he had sought from the beginning, compact enough to hold cut shape when faced correctly, and stable enough to resist lateral seep with proper stone lining. He shifted from vertical digging to chamber work, shaping a barrel-vaulted interior with sidewalls laid in riverstone and lime mortar, 3 feet thick at the base and tapering to 2 feet near the crown. Not for show, but for thermal steadiness. He set vent paths in opposite corners to permit controlled draw, 1 intake low, 1 exhaust high, each lined in stone to reduce condensation drip. He planned a second flue, though material had not yet arrived. He set door frames in double sequence so an outer opening would break wind before inner access released stored heat. The geometry was austere and exact. The purpose was simple. Food must hold. Heat must last. On October 14th, a warm spell pushed afternoon temperatures to 68 and gave the false impression of a delayed winter. But Kane noted what others did not linger over. Geese passing low in tight lines 3 weeks early. Beaver work along Cotton Creek raised higher than trappers recalled in 10 years, and a brittle edge in evening wind that suggested not gradual cooling, but sudden descent. He rode to town council that night and spoke in plain terms of an early killing winter and probable rail disruption before New Year if storms stacked west of Laramie. He presented no theatrics and no prophecy, only indicators, supply math, and dates. The room listened, then deferred to prevailing confidence and regular freight assumptions. By the third week of October, Sage Hollow still moved through market days and church suppers, as if schedules were a form of weather protection, while Kane extended his chamber farther into the slope, squared storage bays, and began laying plank platforms above packed stone so sacks and crates would breathe. At dusk, when maples stood tied near the work light and the town carried on behind the rise, Kane ran a hand over the finished mortar seam and said, "Quite enough for horse and night alone. Let them talk if they must. Words do not keep out the wind." Maple lowered her head and blew steam into the dark, while Kane returned to the shaft, checked the plumb line by lantern, and reset the brace on the west wall where clay met broken stone. Night settled cold over Sage Hollow, and from the churchyard ridge the lamps in town looked close enough to touch and as distant as another county. He worked until the wick shortened, then covered the opening with rough planks and canvas, weighing each corner with stone so no drifting grit would fall into the cut. At dawn he returned with the mule wagon and a load of river rock, each piece chosen for shape rather than size, because a tight wall held heat better than a quick wall. He mixed lime mortar in a shallow box, 1 part lime to 3 parts, screened sand, adding water by cup until the paste stood on the trowel without running. On October 18th, when morning stood at 31 degrees and a fine skin of ice covered the stock trough behind Pike General Goods, Kane set the first full interior course of stone inside the chamber extension and began the vault in measured arcs. He used a wooden form cut from salvaged boards, raised by wedges, and laid each stone so its weight pressed toward the center rather than outward to the cut face. It was slow work and precise work. A rushed joint opened by January. A sound joint carried a family through March. He marked each section completed in Eland's ledger and added a second column for projected spoilage reduction, calculated against ordinary pantry storage at surface temperatures. The figures were not hopeful. They were stern, practical, and built from winters already lived. By 21st October, he had spent another $6 on nails, $2.75 on lamp oil and tins, and $1.20 on wool scrap for gasket packing, and he wrote each figure in the same careful hand beneath the heading Sage Hollow Winter Reserve. He divided the chamber floor with chalk lines into bays 3 feet wide, leaving a central path of 28 inches for hauling and a turning circle near the stove position. Potato bins would stand against the north wall where temperature varied least. Salt pork crocks would remain on raised planks at the east end. Dried apples and beans would sit higher on slatted shelves where air moved dry and steady. He was not arranging goods. He was arranging survival by sequence of use, fuel cost, and spoilage risk. The town watched and interpreted according to habit. Ezra Flint, who had sold him the parcel, stood one afternoon with 2 carpenters and remarked that no sensible builder put that much labor underground when level land sat open to the south. He spoke loudly enough for teamsters watering horses nearby to hear. Kane answered while fitting a hinge pin into the outer door frame, saying only that southern light did not matter if wind scoured roof and wall to matchsticks. Flint smiled without warmth and told him he built like a man planning to outlast a siege no one had declared. Kane set the pin, tested the swing, and returned to work. There was no further exchange. 3 days passed before the council posted its winter guidance near the church steps, and the language carried Gideon Pike's confidence from ledger into policy. Families were advised to conserve cash through October and wait for November rail freight before purchasing heavy provisions. Prices would remain fair, the notice claimed, under ordinary market movement. Bulk buying before schedule was called unnecessary alarm. Pike repeated those lines at his counter and at the hitching rail, tapping his account book with one gloved finger as if arithmetic itself were shelter. When Kane arrived for 2 sacks of pickling salt and asked the quoted rate, Pike named a figure above the marked board. Kane paid without protest, recorded the overcharge to the cent, and loaded his wagon in silence. By the final week of October, the excavation reached 19 feet at its deepest point, where the slope permitted full cover above the vault crown, and Kane began the double-door assembly with wool gasket seams pressed between plain pine surfaces. The outer door was thick and heavy, built to break wind and hold drift pressure. The inner door was lighter, seated true against felt and leather to seal warmth. Between them he left a 5-foot vestibule where snow could be knocked from coats and boots before entry. He packed sawdust between the timber lining and the cut earth in the upper passage, then capped the fill with clay so settling would not tear the frame in freeze-thaw cycles. Every seam had a reason. Every reason had a number beside it in the ledger. On November 2nd, with dawn at 24 degrees and a west wind that carried the smell of distant snow, Kane rode to Cotton Creek and checked the beaver dams again. They held higher still. He found muskrat runs cut deeper into bank grass and geese, lifting at first light in disciplined, low formations that did not circle back. Near noon, he met Thomas Reed at the blacksmith shed and asked whether freight teams from Laramie had reported delays. Reed, broad-handed and soot-streaked, said one team had turned back after axle trouble in heavy mud, west of Medicine Bow, and another had arrived late with a half load. He did not dismiss the warning. He did not act on it either. Work at the forge was paid by the day, and caution did not settle debts. At church supper the following Saturday, Pike gave the mockery its line that would follow Kane through winter. Holding a cup of coffee near the stove, he told a circle of ranch hands and clerks that the man mining for survival intended to live alone while decent souls froze together, and laughter answered him with the easy cruelty of a room that feared scarcity but preferred to mock caution. The phrase traveled quickly. By Monday, boys at the rail platform called after Kane as he passed with sacks in his wagon. Women at wash lines repeated the words with a shake of the head, less sharp than the men but no less dismissive. Social exclusion formed without vote or announcement. He was no longer merely strange. He had become a warning against dissent. Kane enlarged his purchases while freight remained possible. Though Pike refused fair bulk rates and sold first-quality flour to others before weighing his share. In November, he paid $27 for potatoes by the barrel lot, $9 for dried apples from a Mormon freight train passing north, $11 for 2 small iron stoves with cracked enamel but sound fireboxes, and $3.40 for additional pickling salt. He bought turnips, onions, navy beans, lamp chimneys, seed grain, lard, and hard soap in measured lots, never clearing a shelf, never leaving enough cash on the counter to invite argument about his purpose. He brought each load to the cellar, checked moisture by touch, culled bruised produce at once, and stacked sound goods by date. Discipline replaced conversation. By November 17th, Sage Hollow carried the brittle brightness that often precedes hard weather on the high plains, and nights dropped to 12 degrees while afternoons still rose above freezing in deceptive calm. Kane finished lining the second ventilation flue with riverstone and fitted a rotating cap at the surface opening, a simple iron collar with adjustable plate that could be turned by a gloved hand to control draw, without sending warm interior air into the storm in one wasteful rush. He marked vent positions on a board near the inner door with charcoal notches for open half and banked flow, then taught Clara Dempsey, who had begun delivering eggs for barter, how to read frost at the flue mouth. She listened, repeated each instruction, and asked no foolish questions. Thanksgiving week brought 2 light snows and a thaw that turned streets to rutted mud. and this false gentleness strengthened Pike's standing more than any speech. Teamsters reached town with ordinary delay. A rail clerk reported no formal disruption on the spur. Men at the store counter said winter had been exaggerated by newcomers who mistook geese for prophecy. Pike leaned on polished wood in a new wool coat and spoke of commerce as if it were climate itself, steady and rational, governed by books and timetables rather than wind and chance. Yet by the last day of November, Kane had finished loading his chamber and vestibule, tested both stoves, and posted a ration slate near the entry. Flour, beans, root vegetables, salt pork, lamp oil, wood, coal, days remaining by household size. On December the 2nd at 9 in the morning, the first blizzard struck from the northwest with winds measured later at 20 miles an hour near the rail cut, and by noon, whiteout erased the road between church and store to less than 20 yards. Snow drove under eaves, through warped window frames and into stable doors, whose latches had held every ordinary storm. Pike kept his storefront open until dusk, then shut against drift and announced prices would adjust with freight uncertainty. Flour rose from 4 cents to 9 cents per pound by Sunday. Coal climbed from $9 to $16 a ton by Tuesday. Families paid because they had not yet understood the duration of what had arrived. Kane did not enter the argument. He checked his vent caps every 3 hours and kept the chamber at 52 degrees. 5 days later, on December 7th, the second storm followed before roads could be cleared, burying fence lines, sealing wagon ruts, and breaking telegraph contact westward after noon when poles iced and one line dropped near the cut. The Union Pacific spur failed west of Laramie under drift and stalled engines, and no resupply reached Sage Hollow before Christmas. Pike raised prices again, flour to 14 cents, coal to $26, while shelves thinned from staples to lamp chimneys, spoiled molasses, and odd bolts of cloth no one could eat. Men began burning broken chairs and cratewood for heat. Women rendered the last of autumn fat into candle stubs. In houses built for ordinary winters, frost spread across interior walls in white fern patterns that did not melt by midday. Kane kept working. He hauled additional wood to the vestibule, repaired a cracked barrel hoop, and shifted sacks away from one damp corner where mortar had not fully cured. He made a second ration board with columns for souls per household, fuel condition, and medical need, though he had not yet opened distribution to the town at large. He was preparing for that hour all the same, on the evening of December the 24th, while church bells rang thin through moving snow and Pike's shelves stood nearly bare. Kane stood at the cellar entrance, looked over the drifted roofs of Sage Hollow, and tied a fresh coil of rope beside the inner door, where a man could find it by touch in darkness. He tied a second coil beside the first, then ran his thumb along each knot and corrected spacing until every mark stood at 6 feet exactly, because in whiteout, a hand could count what an eye could not. He carried the coils into the vestibule, hung them on separate pegs for Church Road, Store Road, and Creek Lane, and fixed a wooden tally board under the lamp so no team left without a return count. Snow struck the outer door in dry, rattling bursts. The inner chamber remained steady at 53 degrees. On Christmas morning, the wind eased for 4 hours, and Kane used that narrow interval to extend the shelter system in ways no one in town had asked for and no one yet understood. He set 2 cedar posts outside the entry and bored them for a crossbar at chest height, then wound spare line around the bar in layered loops that could be paid out one-handed by a gloved rescuer. He cut 12 marker strips from flour sacks, dipped them in tallow and soot, and tied them at knot intervals so touch and texture both could guide movement in darkness. At noon, he harnessed Maple to a low freight sledge built from wagon runners and hauled split cottonwood from the church shed to his own slope, stacking it under canvas in measured rows of 1/4 cord each, 8 rows in total, each row labeled with chalk by date of cutting and moisture condition. By the final week of December, he had turned the chamber from storage room into operating system. He moved potatoes from deep bins into 3-day issue crates near the vestibule, shifted beans into lidded barrels marked by weight in 50-pound increments, and built a thaw bench from spare plank over the east stove so frozen canteens could warm in stages rather than crack. He set 1 iron kettle permanently at simmer to temper incoming water, 1 kettle for broth, and 1 kettle dry for emergency sterilizing. He cut pallet poles to 6 feet and lashed them in stacked tiers along the south wall, leaving a 20-inch aisle between each tier for airflow and nursing access. He tested both flues with lamp smoke, charted draw at full and banked positions, and wrote a vent schedule in charcoal so any literate volunteer could run the chamber without his presence. Rotate at 3-hour intervals, check frost collars, clear ice at cap hinge, never open both doors at once. He did not merely count food. He counted fuel to the hour. 1 pound of coal banked in stone stove with partial draw gave 68 minutes of useful heat at interior target, 50 degrees. 1 split of dry cottonwood gave 18 minutes at the same setting. Wet wood wasted half its promise and doubled smoke burden. He wrote these figures in Eland's ledger beside household allotment mathematics and added a column for labor demand, because rescuers consume more than those lying still. For 31 souls, hard weather rations stood at 93 pounds flour per week, 46 pounds beans, and 19 pounds pork once shortages forced strict reduction. The numbers were severe and exact. Hunger did not care about sentiment. On December 27th, he made a final purchasing circuit through town with cash wrapped in oilcloth, buying what little remained useful before scarcity hardened into hoarding. From Pike, he took 2 cracked lantern globes for 20 cents each, a crate of hard soap at reduced rate, and 4 sacks of coarse meal that had drawn moisture but could still be salvaged by pan-drying. From Thomas Reed's shed, he bought 3 lengths of chain and 6 forged eyelets for $1.10, then set those eyelets into church fence posts and marked the corner sill of Pike General Goods for a later fixed rope point above drift line. From Ruth Callahan he accepted, in barter for lamp oil, 2 wool blankets she had patched with meticulous care, each seam doubled for pull strength. He logged every transfer by source and purpose, not as inventory pride, but as accountability if he did not survive the season. The town watched this labor with a mixture of reliance and resentment that grew sharper with each empty shelf. Gideon Pike reopened his counter on 28th December for 2 hours under strict cash terms and spoke to each customer as if scarcity had come from distant rail incompetence rather than his own assurances. When Kane stepped in for lampwick and vinegar, Pike kept his hand on the ledger and said in a tone loud enough for the queue to hear that men who planned private fortresses should not expect public accommodation when honest trade tightened. A ranch hand behind Kane laughed and repeated the old line about mining for survival, adding that perhaps the miner had found enough dirt to eat. No one challenged the remark. Kane paid, took his parcel, and left with no answer beyond a nod to the clerk who had wrapped the goods. Social exclusion moved from speech to practice. At church dinner that Sunday, benches were crowded by design before Kane arrived, and no one shifted to make room. At the pump line, 2 women lowered their voices when he approached, then resumed in plain hearing that fear made men ungenerous and ungenerous men should winter alone. Ezra Flint, standing by the hitch rail in a fur-collared coat that still looked prosperous, said Kane had spent 2 months preparing to watch neighbors beg at his door. He said it with the calm authority of a builder who had never tested his walls below 0 for 10 straight days. The words traveled house to house and returned in altered forms, each version more confident in judging character than in reading weather. Yet the same household sent children quietly to his slope at dusk with small barter offers and careful questions. One brought eggs and asked how to keep carrots from freezing in a shallow pit. Another carried rendered tallow and asked how much flour a family of 5 should reserve if roads closed until February. Cain answered each without commentary on pride or gossip. He measured by souls, by age, by fuel remaining, and wrote the arithmetic on scrap for them to carry home. Some followed it, some did not. In daylight, several of those same fathers repeated Pike's language at the store steps, claiming frontier people required grit, not bunker habits. At night, they nailed quilts over windows and fed fence pickets into stoves. 3 days passed before council posted a second notice, this one advising households to remain calm and avoid unauthorized distribution points that might spread panic. The phrase pointed toward Cain without naming him. Gideon Pike stood beneath the notice when it was nailed and declared that centralized order would keep Sage Hollow from descending into scramble. He promised another freight attempt within 10 days, though no confirmation had come through the dead telegraph cut. Cain read the notice once, folded a copy into his ledger, and spent the afternoon teaching Clara Dempsey how to tie a bowline that could be loosened after freezing. She learned the knot in 6 attempts and then taught it back to him with fingers reddened by cold. As December closed, warning signs multiplied with brutal clarity for anyone willing to see pattern over comfort. The creek did not merely freeze, it froze in uneven pressure ridges that rose like broken stone where current should have remained moving. Ravens that usually rode morning thermals above the slaughter yard flew low and inland before noon. Cattle on the north lots turned their hindquarters into the wind and refused feed through hours when they normally crowded troughs. Smoke from chimneys no longer lifted and dispersed, but flattened at roofline and ran east in a continuous gray shelf, signaling dense cold pressing downward. Cain walked Cotton Creek once more and found the beaver spillways capped with fresh mud and branchwork above even the November height. Labor done in haste by animals that read barometer better than any town committee. On January 1st, 1888, noon temperature reached 16 degrees under clear sun, and that brief brightness misled many into believing the worst had passed. Pike seized the moment, opened his doors, and offered limited flour at 13 cents with the assurance that regular movement would resume before the month turned. Men in line spoke of luck holding. Women carried small sacks home with relief that looked almost like celebration. Cain spent the same hours outside his cellar cutting wind baffles from discarded doors and planting them at angles upslope to reduce direct drift against the entry. He measured each baffle at 4 feet high, set 3 feet apart, and tied their tops with wire so gusts would flex rather than snap them. Maples stood hitched nearby, ears pinned against a wind that had not yet arrived but was already forming in the west. That evening he convened no meeting and sought no authority. He walked to the church, to Pike's store, and to the blacksmith shed with a coil of rope over one shoulder, and asked each place to accept fixed anchor points before the next storm. Thomas Reed agreed at once and helped sink an eye bolt into the forge sill. Reverend Heil hesitated, then permitted 2 anchors at the church steps after Cain demonstrated load pull with chain and mule trace. Pike refused on first request, saying rope lines invited disorder and suggested defeat. Cain answered only that rope did not create weather, it made return possible. After a long pause and visible calculation, Pike allowed 1 bolt at the store corner but insisted it be removed when freight resumed. By January 3rd, wind shifted north-northwest and hardened. Night fell to -22. Water buckets left 10 minutes unguarded, skinned over thick enough to hold nails. The false calm broke not with thunder but with a clean, punishing drop that took breath on first inhalation. and turned exposed skin wax pale in minutes. Kane moved through his checklists by lantern: vent cap free, stove grates clean, ash pit emptied, emergency broth prepared, thaw bench heated, rope coils dry, spare mittens laid in pairs by size. He posted a slate at the outer door with 3 lines written large enough for frozen eyes. Knock twice for food. Knock 3 times for heat. Knock without shame. The mockery did not cease at once, even then. 2 ranch hands passed his slope near dusk and called through the wind that the burro keeper had finally hung his shop sign. Their laughter was brief and brittle. One of them returned before midnight with cracked lips and asked for 2 pounds of beans on credit against spring wages. Kane weighed the beans, wrote the name, and handed over a wool strip for wrapping the sack under coat. No lecture followed. The transaction lasted less than a minute. On January 4th, Ezra Flint came to inspect his own unfinished storage shed after drift had jammed its doors, and he found the roof seams open where he had saved cost on pitchcloth in autumn. He stood in the yard, kicking at frozen planks while Kane and Thomas Reed passed with chain and sledge. Flint asked without greeting whether the cellar could truly hold 50 degrees in this cold. Kane said it held 51 that morning with half fuel burn, because Earth answered patience if given depth and stone. Flint looked toward town, where chimney smoke clung low and did not rise, and said nothing more. He did not apologize. He did not repeat old insults either. He only asked how long potatoes would keep below ground. Kane told him the truth, with dry bins and culling into March. Another line of warning came from silence. Dogs that usually barked through evening went quiet across Sage Hollow, conserving breath and curling against whatever warmth they could find. The rail spur remained cut, and no whistle sounded from west or east for 6 consecutive days. The absence became its own weather report. Kane marked it in the ledger margin, then added projected reductions for lamp oil and flour if no resupply came by the 10th. He moved 1 barrel of seed grain deeper into the chamber and wrote across the lid in cold pencil: planting stock. Do not consume unless death stands at door. On January 5th, the sky carried a hard metallic color from morning onward, and by afternoon fine snow began to move sideways, not falling but driven, each grain sharp as sifted salt. Kane tightened Maple's breast collar, checked the store anchor himself, and walked the route from cellar to church, counting knots by gloved hand, through blowing drift. 6 feet, 12, 18, 24. Each interval memorized by muscle. At the church steps, he found Clara Dempsey and her mother trying to keep a blanket over a basket of hens that had gone rigid with cold. He took the basket, wrapped it in burlap, and told them to keep moving indoors before fingers failed. By nightfall, he had set the outer lantern low and shielded, left the first rope line paid out to the post, and banked both stoves for sustained draw. He stood in the vestibule with ledger open, pencil ready, while wind struck the doors in long, heavy pulses. The town above still argued about panic and pride, about private stores and public order, about whether this storm would pass in a day as others had. Beneath the slope, stone held its temperature. Fuel waited in stacked rows. Rations stood measured to the pound. Kane listened for the first knock. The first knock came at 7 minutes past midnight, light and uncertain under the weight of wind. Kane opened the outer door into a wall of driven snow and found Clara Dempsey on the threshold rope, her scarf iced stiff at the edges, 1 mitten missing, a folded note tied to her wrist with sewing thread so it could not blow away. The basket at her feet held 2 hens gone rigid in the cold. He drew her into the vestibule, shut the storm out in 2 stages, and set her by the east stove while he read by lamplight. Her mother had written in a steady hand that their wood was gone. Her youngest had fever, and she would trade any labor for flour, beans, and one corner of warm floor through the night. Kane wrote their household number on the slate, weighed 6 pounds of flour and 3 of beans, marked 1 pallet, and handed Clara broth before asking any further question. By dawn on January 6, 1888, the storm had thickened from hard weather into siege weather. The thermometer nailed beside Kane's door read -34 at first light, then held there through the morning as wind drove long white sheets across the basin and erased rooflines until church, store, and stable appeared as low drifts with chimneys. He paid out the church rope line to full length, set knot counts in his hands, and sent Clara back under escort with a load sledge carrying fuel splits, broth jars wrapped in wool, and the 2 hens now thawing for stew. She returned before noon with 3 families as the note had promised she might, each one carrying what they could still offer: 1 sack of meal damp at the corners, a box of nails, 2 quilts, a kettle, and a child too weak to walk. Pride had not vanished, but cold had broken its command. Through that day and into the next, Kane converted private reserve into public ration station with the discipline of a quartermaster rather than the sentiment of a host. He chalked household names by soul count, fuel status, and medical need. He set issue hours to reduce door cycling. He moved produce and grain according to immediate use and spoilage risk, and he assigned vent rotation every 3 hours, including night watches. So no one soul carried the full burden. The chamber held between 51 and 52 degrees, while outside cold deepened and stayed, because earth and stone answered steady method when timber walls above ground failed. At Pike General Goods, the shelves that had once stood in orderly confidence were stripped to lamp chimneys, cracked crockery, and sticky tins of molasses turned sour. Cash no longer solved anything. The ledger that had governed Sage Hollow could not summon a rail engine through buried cuts. After 2 more days of whiteout, on January 8th, the basin saw full daylight again. The wind increased after noon and pushed drift against south walls high enough to bury lower windows, and by evening men crossing open ground had to crawl final yards to doorways to avoid being rolled off their feet. Kane led rope line teams from cellar post to church steps, from church to blacksmith shed, and from shed to the corner bolt at Pike's store. Each line marked every 6 feet, so distance could be counted by touch when sight failed. He placed the strongest walkers at front and rear, tied all with waist loops, and ordered no one to leave line for dropped bundles, hats, or tools. The weather wasn't wind now, but force, striking at angles, searching openings, turning one wrong step into disappearance. Structures built for ordinary winters began to declare their limits in loud, splintering sounds that carried through the white. Ruth Callahan died on the church line just before dawn on January 10th, and the story of it remained in Sage Hollow longer than any sermon. She was 62, narrow-shouldered and known across 3 counties for delivering infants in cabins where no physician would ride in time. During a transfer from church stove to cellar pallets, she found an infant in Clara Dempsey's family, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the crossing, and stopped the line long enough to untie her own heavier wool shawl and wind it around the child and mother together. The delay cost only moments. The gift cost more. By the time they reached Kane's vestibule, Ruth's hands had gone pale and unresponsive, and though they warmed her slowly at the thaw bench and kept broth at her lips, her breathing never recovered strength. She died before noon with Reverend Hale reading low from memory because pages would not stay dry near the door. On January 11th, near sundown, Eli Mercer was found in a wagon lean-to behind a collapsed feed shed where his family had sheltered after their stovepipe failed, and smoke drove them out. Eli was 9 years old, slight as a fence rail, and he had taken his baby sister under the wagon canvas when the wind shifted, then wrapped both hands around her feet inside his coat to keep warmth in her as long as he could. The rescue team reached them by rope after Clara heard shouting between gusts and ran for Kane. The baby survived the night with warmed cloth and goat milk stretched with broth. Eli did not survive the carryback. Kane wrote the boy's name on the ration slate margin so no one would assign his share by error, then struck the line through with one straight mark when morning came. In the chamber there was no public display of grief. There was work, and there were quiet faces turned toward the stove. On January 12th, with cold still below -20 and no break in the rail line, Thomas Reed broke his wagon tongue for firewood behind the blacksmith shed after his coal bin emptied and drift sealed his back door. 2 hired boys from his shop, both younger than 20, reached him at dusk with one scuttle of coal salvaged from church storage. Thomas put the scuttle by their feet and told them to burn it through the night without sharing the firebox with greenwood, because greenwood would choke draft and kill them by morning. He sat against the forge wall in his coat while they slept in turns, and did not wake when they shook him at first light. Kane and Ezra Flint brought him in on the sledge after breakfast, wrapped in canvas and one of Ruth Callahan's patched blankets that had not yet returned to her family. No one spoke on that trip except to count knots. That same night, drift load broke the north half of Pike's storefront roof with a single downward groan and a crash muffled by snow. Shelving tipped, flour dust rose and settled in damp clumps, and the merchant who had once stood in kid gloves behind polished counter stumbled into the street in a torn wool coat, carrying his account books under one arm, as if numbers might still purchase shelter. He reached Kane's rope line by instinct and fear more than sight. When the rescue team brought him to the vestibule, he was shaking so hard he could not unbutton his own collar. Kane took the books from his hands, set them on a dry crate away from stove sparks, stripped Pike's gloves, checked fingers for frostbite, and directed him to a pallet beside the east wall. No terms were named. No old words were repeated. There was no room in that weather for theater. By January 13th, the chamber and its connected shelters held 31 souls on rotating occupancy, while others received rations and returned to houses still standing. Kane posted allotments each morning by household size and labor demand, and he enforced them with the same fairness for friend and mocker. He gave Pike the same flour weight as any single adult in light duty, then assigned him to dry wood rotation and ledger copying, because his hands, once rewarmed, remained steady with pen. He sent Clara as runner within the rope network with 2 older escorts, carrying notes sealed in waxed cloth so families could report fever, fuel state, and missing kin without shouting into storm. Reverend Hale kept a list of names at the church stove and rang one bell at each successful return so teams outside could count survivors through the wind. The system was not grand. It was consistent, and consistency was life. Near midnight on January the 14th, when gusts finally began to shorten and spaces between them widened, a group from the north lots arrived at Kane's door as one body against the rope, led by Ezra Flint, and including 2 ranch hands who had mocked from the road a week earlier. They carried no barter left worth naming, only 1 sack of frozen turnips and a kettle handle bent out of shape. Flint removed his hat in the vestibule, snow running from the brim onto packed earth, and said they had come to ask shelter for 6 souls and to work under any rule set before them. Kane marked 6 names on the slate, pointed to spare pallets and to the wood stack that needed splitting by dawn, and told them where to hang wet coats so ice would not soak the flour sacks. He handed each man a mug of broth in turn, then moved to the door again when the next knock sounded. The next knock came hard, 3 blows in quick succession, then 2 more as if the hand outside had forgotten the count. Kane opened into blowing white and found Reverend Hale and Gideon Pike's clerk, Samuel Voss, roped together at the waist with a child between them wrapped in a horse blanket. The child was breathing. Barely. Kane brought all three through the vestibule, shut the outer door, and pointed Ezra Flint and the two ranch hands toward the stove kettles. "Boots off by the grate, then hands under cloth, not on iron," he said. "If you heat too fast, you lose fingers you could have kept." They obeyed because obedience had become plain sense. By first light on January 15th, the rope network carried movement every hour between Cellar, church, and the half-cleared blacksmith shed. Kane ran it as he had run his ledger, by sequence, by weight, by time. He assigned Pike to dry goods accounting and issue marks, Samuel Voss to lamp trimming, Clara Dempsey to message runs with 2 escorts, and Ezra Flint to door cycle watch so no one opened both doors at once in haste. The men who had paid $26 a ton for coal in December now split damp cratewood under Kane's count and learned that one careless armload could waste an hour of heat. In the chamber, teaching traveled beside every ration scoop. Kane showed how to read frost around the vent caps and adjust draw by quarter turns rather than guesswork. He demonstrated staged thaw for water barrels, snow in cloth sacks first, then slush in kettles, then liquid into oak with space left for expansion. He set children to culling potatoes for soft spots and explained spoilage in numbers they could repeat. If 1 in 10 was bruised and left in place, 1 in 4 would fail by February. If bruised ones were separated at once, losses held near 1 in 12. Nothing in his speech rose to sermon. Nothing in his method permitted waste. 3 days passed before wind slackened enough to hear voices outside the rope line, and by then Sage Hollow had learned the difference between display and endurance. Pike's roof lay broken under drift, and his gold watch had stopped from cold. Ezra Flint's pitched shed stood with seams sprung open. 2 ranch houses with painted trim had burned half their furniture and still held ice on interior nails. Kane's buried chamber, built for $42 in materials and months of mock labor, held at 50 degrees with disciplined firing and sealed doors. The contrast required no argument. Every soul in line could feel it in their own lungs. On January 19th, with morning at -12 instead of -30, Kane led a work party to recover salvage from Pike General Goods. They moved by knot count, 6 feet at a touch, and cut into drift through the storefront side where wall braces still held. From under fallen shelving, they pulled 2 sacks of barley feed dry at the center, 1 crate of salt, and Pike's main account ledger in warped leather. Pike held the ledger in both hands for a long moment, then set it on the sledge beside beans and lamp oil, as if admitting its new rank. Paper could record hunger. It could not end it. In the cellar that night, Reverend Hale asked whether Kane would open seed grain marked for planting stock. Kane shook his head. "Not while there is any other arithmetic left," he said. "If we eat spring, we borrow graves from next winter." No one disputed him. By 24th January, the storm system broke into intervals, then returned in shorter blows. Kane used each lull to turn rescue into instruction. He walked household heads through wall thickness with a shovel handle, showing how earth cover and stone mass traded labor in autumn for fuel in January. He marked depth lines on the churchyard slope and made them repeat the measure aloud. 14 feet to hard clay minimum. Deeper if slope allowed. 2 flues opposite corners. Intake low and exhaust high. Vestibule between doors. Wool gasket compressed but not crushed. He gave each family a copy from Aylin's ledger pages he had recopied by lamplight, including pounds per soul per week at reduced winter ration. Those pages passed hand to hand, with care usually reserved for scripture. On February 2nd, the first rail whistle sounded faint from the east after 62 days of broken supply, and men stepped from the church to listen as if hearing a name called from far water. Freight did not arrive that day. The cut west remained blocked, but the sound altered planning from pure emergency to survival with Horizon, and Kane adjusted allotments upward by small increments to preserve strength for repair crews. When thaw water finally began to drip from South Eaves on March the 3rd, 1888, Sage Hollow looked like a place recovered from siege rather than weather. Drifts stood shoulder high between buildings. Fences surfaced in broken lines. 31 souls had rotated through Kane's shelter network at Peak Burden, and many more had eaten by his ration board while sleeping in damaged homes. The 3 dead were named in every household prayer by then: Ruth Callahan, Eli Mercer, Thomas Reed. That afternoon, Pike sent word through Reverend Hale that he asked for a church gathering before any spring trade resumed. Kane came at dusk and stood near the rear wall, coat still carrying Cellar earth at the cuff. The church held almost all 312 souls who remained in town, benches crowded, aisles lined, hats in hands. No one laughed. No one stared past him as they had in October. Gideon Pike rose first. He wore a plain coat without gloves, and the prosperous polish had gone from him with the roof timbers. "I said in this town," he began, voice carrying clear in the still air, "that Kane Jordan was mining for gold in dirt because grief had taken his judgment. I said he meant to live alone while decent souls froze together. I said his warning was alarm, and his work was vanity. Men repeated me because I held credit over their tables, and I let that authority stand in place of truth. When freight failed and cold struck, I raised prices, and families paid because they trusted my assurances. Then my shelves emptied, my roof failed, and I carried my ledger to the very door I had mocked. He took me in without one condition. I was wrong in judgment and wrong in conduct. I cannot repair the dead, but I can place what remains under rules better than my own." He lifted a folded paper. It listed remaining inventory, tools, and claims to be transferred at cost to a communal winter reserve held by rotating families, not a single merchant account. He signed it at the pulpit table with Samuel Voss and Reverend Hale as witnesses. Ezra Flint stood next. "I sold him badger ground with a joke," he said. "I called his labor folly in front of men who trusted my building hand. My own shed failed in the first hard drift. His walls held. If he permits it, I will oversee cellar cuts for any household that asks, and I will take no builder premium for the first season." After him came others, not in one rehearsed line but in halting sequence, each naming words once spoken at hitch rails, pump lines, and church suppers. One ranch hand repeated the laughter about dirt to eat. A woman who had refused him bench space at dinner said fear had turned her mean while pretending to keep order. Reverend Hale admitted he had blessed prudence from the pulpit, but deferred in private to merchant optimism because calm seemed easier than warning. Confession did not make grief lighter. It made truth usable. When they had finished, silence settled and turned toward Kane. He did not step to the pulpit at once. He walked to the front, placed Elan's copied ration sheet beside Pike's transfer paper, and faced the room. Elan's mother taught that food and shelter are obligations before they are possessions, he said. Elan taught me that numbers are mercy when weather is cruel, because numbers do not flatter pride. I did not dig that chamber to be right against neighbors. I dug it because winter on this ground is older than all of us and doesn't care what we call one another. Do not ask me for a clean word tonight that erases what was said. Ruth Callahan is dead. Eli Mercer is dead. Thomas Reed is dead. Their names stay with the cost of our learning. He set his hand on the paper. I will teach any household here to build deep storage. I will mark depth, vent, and ration with you at your own door. In return, each household that learns will teach the next one after it, and no one will sell panic at a profit when roads close. Whether you name that forgiveness is your own account to settle. Mine is simpler. No soul stands alone when weather turns. No one applauded. They rose, one bench at a time, and formed work lists by lantern, dig teams, stone teams, timber salvage, lime orders when rail reopened, and widow support for the Mercer and Reed families through spring. By the second week of April, as mud replaced drift in the streets, Kane and Ezra Flint laid the first shared cellar pattern behind the Callahan house lot, though Ruth no longer lived to use it. The cut measured 10 by 12, then widened below to chamber span, just as Kane's had, but with one change he insisted upon: an interior memorial board at the entrance listing the 3 dead before any bin labels were painted. Preparedness would be tied to memory, not boasting. Through 1888 and 1889, Sage Hollow built 16 earth-bermed cellars to what men began calling Jordan depth, no longer in mockery but as specification: minimum 14 feet, preferred 18 to 19 where slope permitted, double doors, wool seams, opposite flues, posted ration math by soul count. Pike kept his transfer terms and served as storekeeper under council oversight. Prices fixed by posted freight cost, plus narrow margin during emergency months. Samuel Voss audited weights in public view every Saturday through winter. Kane remained deliberate and unspectacular in all of it. He charged for materials when he must, never for instruction. He taught children to count knots on rescue lines each autumn and made them practice with eyes closed. Clara Dempsey, taller each year and steady as any teamster, became his most trusted runner and later his instructor for vent rotation at the summer school sessions held in the cool of the original chamber. Years later, in 1902, the first cellar Kane dug behind the churchyard slope still stood sound, its stone vault dry, its temperature near 55 in January and August alike. In summer, it served as a schoolroom for provisioning arithmetic and winter drills. In hard months, it returned to reserve storage, bins labeled by household contribution and draw. At its entrance hung the cedar board with 3 names carved deep: Ruth Callahan, Eli Mercer, Thomas Reed. The phrase that once carried ridicule remained in local speech, but its meaning had been remade by labor and loss. New families arriving by rail heard it from old hands at the pump and in the church aisle, spoken not with laughter but instruction. Mine for survival first, and no soul stands alone when the weather turns. A week after that, saying passed from the pump to the church aisle once more. A freight wagon from the east stop brought a widow named Maud Kincaid and her 2 grown sons to Sage Hollow, and they asked at Pike's counter what the phrase meant and why men touched the brim of their hats when they said it. Gideon Pike did not send them to another mouth. He closed his ledger, came out from behind the counter, and walked them up the churchyard slope himself, boots sinking in thaw-soft mud where drifts had stood shoulder-high in January. At the cellar entrance, he removed his gloves, laid his palm on the stone lintel, and said, with no ornament, "It means this town once mistook commerce for preparedness, and 3 graves taught us the difference." Kane was inside with Clara Dempsey, now near 15, and carrying a carpenter's rule in her apron pocket like a badge of office. They were resetting a slat rack above the north bins and relabeling jars of dried apples with charcoal dates, because Kane required every preserved lot to carry month and source before it entered common stock. The 2 cracked lantern globes bought from Pike in December now hung mended with wire collars over the vestibule bench, still useful, still giving clear light. The warped leather account ledger pulled from Pike's ruined store rested on a shelf beside Eland's oilcloth volumes, both books open for instruction, one recording profit and debt, the other recording pounds per soul per week and fuel by hour. Kane greeted the newcomers, then handed Maud Kincaid a chalk stub and asked her to copy her household numbers on the ration board. Learning began with one's own arithmetic. By the end of April 1903, 16 cellars stood completed, and a 17th stood half-cut behind the new Kincaid lot. Ezra Flint supervised line and plumb on every dig without premium, as pledged, and he did not permit his apprentices to hurry the unseen work below frostline merely to show speed above ground. One afternoon, while Kane checked the depth post at the Kincaid shaft, Flint set down his level and finally gave voice to the look he had carried since January of 1888. He said he had known, even before the great storms, that his own shade seams were weak because he had saved $3 on pitchcloth, and when he mocked Kane in public, he had been defending his own corner cutting more than any principle of building. Kane listened, tamped clay around the marker stake, and answered, "Then teach the full method until your last season. That is the payment that matters now." Flint nodded once and returned to work, and he did exactly that. On May 9, 1903, Reverend Hale read aloud in the church a letter from the county seat at Laramie acknowledging Sage Hollow's winter memorandum, the one Samuel Voss had copied from Kane's and Pike's records after telegraph service was restored in March of 1888. The county clerk had first dismissed the document as local overreaction when it arrived, then amended his view after comparing mortality counts from 3 nearby settlements that had no reserve plan. He requested duplicate specifications for cellar depth, flue arrangement, and emergency ration tables for circulation to outlying town councils. Hale folded the letter, placed it in Pike's old ledger for safekeeping, and said, "A report delayed is stillborn fruit." It was the final outcome of the broken line season that had once left Sage Hollow without outside guidance. Their own record had become guidance for others. That summer, Kane opened the barrel-marked planting stock, "Do not consume unless death stands at door," and measured out seed grain under witness from 5 families so no one would confuse stewardship with hoarding. Clara read names. Samuel Voss weighed issue on a calibrated scale, and Pike entered each allotment in a communal book that any household could inspect on Saturdays. The grain went to prepared furrows in June and came up in even rows by early July. At harvest, they returned 1 1/2 shares for each share borrowed, per rule adopted after the winter gathering, and the reserve bins filled without argument. The 2 iron stoves bought for $11 years earlier were cleaned, blacked, and set to summer idle. One remained in the original chamber. One moved to the school annex cut behind the church. Nothing acquired in crisis was wasted in peace. On January 14, 1904, exactly 16 years after the worst night, the town held a rope drill in full daylight with children and elders both on the line. Kane made them wear mittened hands and count knot intervals by touch, 6 feet at a time, eyes closed while Clara called cadence and corrected grip. At the memorial board, each child read the 3 carved names aloud before receiving a coil assignment. Ruth Callahan's shawl, preserved by her nieces, hung in a glass front box at the entrance for that day alone. Thomas Reed's last coal scuttle, mended at the rim, stood beside it. Eli Mercer's sister, now a young woman, tied the first marker strip to the church anchor and said, "He kept my feet warm. I keep this line ready." Ritual had taken the place of complacency. Kane remained what he had always been, deliberate and unspectacular, and when the council proposed in 1906 to rename the slope Jordan Hill and mount a brass plaque with his likeness, he refused both with measured clarity. He asked instead for funds equal to the plaque estimate, $23, to buy extra lime and wool felt for households on the outer lots that still used shallow pits. In open meeting, he said, "Names on hills do not hold 50 degrees in January. Stone and depth do." Pike seconded the motion without hesitation. The purchase was approved by a voice vote, and 3 new outer lot cellars were completed before first frost. By the second week of October 1908, a cold rain had begun to harden at the edges, and Kane, now gray at the temples but steady in hand, led what would be his last full autumn class in the original chamber school. He taught from Eland's ledgers, pages softened by years of turning, and had Clara read the finish line copied by Sanna Rautiainen about obligations preceding possessions. Then he placed the ledgers in her hands before witnesses and said they were not heirlooms but tools, to be corrected when local evidence required correction, and never treated as scripture immune to weather. That winter passed hard but orderly. No household in Sage Hollow went below 30 days of provisions. No one sold panic. Kane died in March 1911 after a brief fever, in a bed set in the same chamber where he had once posted the slate that read, "Knock without shame." He was 59. He was buried beside Elin on a clear morning with ground still iron at 2 inches and soft beneath, and the procession included Pike, Flint, Hale, Clara, Samuel Voss, the Mercer family, and the 2 hired boys Thomas Reed had saved. There were no grand speeches at the grave. Clara spoke 1 sentence from the entrance board and closed the ledger clasp with both hands. The chamber still stands. Its stone vault remains dry through spring runoff, and in deep winter its thermometers hold near 55, when vent and stove are managed with the discipline Kane taught. The cedar memorial board at the entrance is renewed when letters fade, always with the same 3 names first, and beneath them, carved later by Clara Dempsey Jordan after her marriage and appointment as school steward, an inscription that has guided 3 generations of Sage Hollow children. Food and shelter are obligations before they are possessions. In hard weather, the church bell still rings once for each rope team returned, and newcomers still learn knot count before they learn gossip. The old phrase remains in use, spoken at seed issue, at cellar inspections, and at autumn classes for families arriving by rail with more optimism than provisions. It means what Gideon Pike told Maud Kincaid on the muddy slope years ago, and what the town has proved each winter since: mine for survival first, and no soul stands alone when the weather turns.